My name is Evaden Whitmore. I am 72 years old, a retired history teacher with more time than I know how to fill, and a stubborn habit of keeping order in a world that seems to grow untidier by the day. I live in a Victorian townhouse on Whitaker Street, not far from Forsyth Park. Its high ceilings and weathered banisters carry the years of my family's life. Every room is thick with memory, and most mornings, I begin the day by walking through them slowly, as though greeting old friends. That morning started as always. I set the kettle on the stove, then arranged a slice of toast on a chipped plate patterned with roses. The porcelain cup I chose for my coffee once belonged to my mother. Its handle is delicate, nearly translucent, but it has survived longer than most things I've held dear. Sitting at the oak table that came from my parents' farm, I felt surrounded by all the anchors that had steadied me since my husband's death. The sunlight reached in through lace curtains, scattering gold across the rug. Savannah mornings have a hush about them, the air still heavy from the river, the streets not yet awake with tourists. I sipped my coffee and listened to the house, breathing around me the faint hum of the refrigerator, the creak of wood settling after a damp night. Caleb had already gone. My son always leaves before dawn, his boots clattering down the porch steps, his truck coughing awake in the street. He tells me he is busy with construction work, though he offers little beyond that. At dinner when he comes home, he answers my questions with single syllables, sometimes avoiding them altogether. His shoulders look heavier than they once did, as if carrying something I cannot name. I tell myself not to worry. Men his age carry burdens they don't share with their mothers. I cleared my dishes, washed them carefully, and placed them back in their places. Routine is what holds me together. Water. The plants wipe the counters, fold the linens. When the world feels uncertain, there is comfort in knowing that at least the windows will be clean, the floor swept the silver polished. Yet that morning, something unsettled me. At first, I thought it was the silence. The house felt too still, the kind of quiet that presses in on you waiting. I drew the curtains wider, letting the sunlight pool across the dining room table, and for a moment the warmth eased me. Then I heard it, a faint, irregular sound. Not the groan of wood, not the tick of the clock, but a sharper note, deliberate and steady. I held my breath. Drip. A pause. Drip. It came from above, from the ceiling over the dining room table where I had just placed my cup. I set down the towel I had been folding and craned my neck to look up. A darker spot marred the plaster, a stain spreading slowly outward. I felt the first twinge of worry in my chest. Caleb had promised me this house was sound, renovated, secure. He had overseen every nail, every pipe, every tile. Yet something was happening above me, something that didn't belong. I fetched a chair and stepped up to touch the ceiling with my fingertips. Dampness clung to the paint, cold against my skin. I climbed down quickly, staring at the wet mark as though it had betrayed me. The room that had always felt most safe suddenly seemed fragile. That was when I realized this was no ordinary morning. Something in my home had begun to change, and I could no longer ignore it. The damp spot spread wider with each drop, leaving a pale ring against the cream paint I had brushed myself only a few years earlier. I pulled the dining chairs aside, fearing the water might stain them, then placed a mixing bowl on the table to catch the rhythm of the leak. The hollow ping of each drop filled the quiet room. I stood there watching it for longer than I meant to. 2 years ago, Caleb had convinced me the renovation would keep this old house sound for decades. He had waived contracts in front of me, insisted on tearing up the plumbing, replacing the pipes, fixing what time had worn thin. I remember his pride when the workers packed up their tools. "This house will outlast both of us, Mama," he said, smiling the way he hadn't since his father died. But it hadn't been strangers I hired. It was his team, his decision. He told me not to interfere, not to hover while men worked. I had trusted him completely. Now the ceiling dripped like a wound reopening, and I couldn't help but wonder what had been done in those weeks when I was told to stay out of the way. The sound grew steadier each drop, hitting the bowl with a splash. I fetched a second towel and spread it over the table, though I knew it would do little. My heart beat faster than such a small problem deserved. It was only water, I told myself, just a leak in an old house. Still, the unease that had crept in earlier settled deeper. I went to the hallway phone, its cord stretched from years of use, and dialed Caleb's number. He answered. On the second ring, his voice clipped. "Mom, I'm at work." "Can it wait?" "There's water coming through the dining room ceiling," I said, forcing calm into my voice. "It's dripping steadily right under the upstairs bathroom." Silence on the line, only the hum of background noise wherever he was. Then a sigh. "Call a plumber." I frowned, pressing the receiver tighter to my ear. "But what about the warranty from the renovation? The work was done only 2 years ago. Shouldn't the company be responsible?" "No," he cut in sharply. "Forget them. Just hire someone new. I'll text you a number." His tone unsettled me. "Caleb, if something went wrong with the pipes, don't you think it should be the same men who installed them? They'd know the system better than anyone." I said no. His voice rose enough that I pulled the phone slightly from my ear. Then he lowered it again, almost muttering, "Those people don't need to come back into the house. Trust me. Just get it fixed." The line went quiet, except for his shallow breathing. My throat tightened. Caleb had never spoken so curtly to me about household matters. He always took pride in making decisions for the house, as though each nail driven into its beams proved his worth. To hear him dismiss the very workers he once praised, men he called reliable, trustworthy, set my nerves on edge. "I'll wait for your number," I said softly. "Good." He hung up before I could add another word. I stood in the hallway phone, still in my hand, listening to the silence that replaced his voice. The house felt different, hollow somehow, as if the sound of dripping water had found its way into my chest. I walked back into the dining room and stared at the ceiling where the stain widened like a spreading bruise. The bowl filled, slowly rippling with each drop. I pulled out another towel and laid it across the floorboards to keep them from swelling. As I knelt, smoothing the towel flat, I felt a heaviness settle over me, not just from the water, but from Caleb's voice, the edge in it, the strange urgency that he not see the men who once repaired our home. I gathered the wet towel into a heap, replaced it with another, and tried to still my hands. Whatever the reason, Caleb didn't want the old company involved, and though I couldn't yet explain why the thought chilled me more than the damp ceiling above my head, I didn't have to wait long. Less than an hour after Caleb's abrupt call, the doorbell rang. I wiped my damp hands on a dish towel, steadying myself before opening the heavy oak door. A man stood there, toolbox in one hand, the other resting against the porch railing as though he'd been measuring the weight of the house before I even appeared. He was of medium height, his frame lean but sturdy, with graying hair brushed neatly back from a weathered face. His glasses caught the glare of the late morning sun, and behind them, his eyes were steady kind, yet carrying a distance that spoke of years seeing more than most would want to. "Mrs. Whitmore." His voice was low professional with a faint accent, softened by decades in Savannah. "Yes. You must be the plumber Caleb sent. Manuel Alvarez." He tipped his head almost like a bow, and stepped inside only when I moved back to let him through. The air shifted as he entered, carrying with it the faint scent of metal and oil. He paused in the foyer not to admire the carved banister or the framed photographs, but to glance at the hallway in both directions, then at the door hinges as though cataloging the house for exits and angles. It was subtle, yet unmistakable, the way someone accustomed to being alert without drawing attention. When his gaze met mine again, it softened as if he had reminded himself to play the part of tradesman rather than sentinel. "The leak is in the dining room," I said, leading him down the hallway. He followed without wasted motion, boots whispering against the rug. In the dining room, he set the toolbox down with surprising care, not the clatter of a hurried worker, but the quiet placement of a man who respected his tools. I pointed to the ceiling where the stain had grown darker. Water still dripped into the bowl below each splash, echoing my unease. Manuel tilted his head back, studying the plaster. His expression hardly changed, just a tightening around the eyes, the slight set of his jaw. He muttered something under his breath in Spanish, then cleared his throat. "I'll need to look at the upstairs bathroom first." "May I?" "Of course." "This way." Upstairs, he inspected the tiled floor and fixtures with an efficiency that unsettled me. He tapped pipes lightly, listening to the hollow responses, then crouched to check beneath the sink. His hands moved quickly, assured but not hurried. 2 years ago, this whole bathroom was redone, I explained. My son oversaw it himself. Manuel looked at me briefly, something unreadable passing across his face before he turned back to the pipes. They changed everything. Yes. New pipes, new tiles, everything. He nodded slowly, then stood. If the leak is showing downstairs and this bathroom was fully renovated, the issue may not be up here. I frowned. Then where the main lines? I'll need to check the basement. I hesitated. The basement had always been ordinary to me. Laundry machines, boxes of holiday decorations, the smell of dust and damp cardboard. It had never been a place of secrets. Still, the firmness in his voice left no room for argument. "The door is in the kitchen," I said. "I can show you. No need. I'll manage," he replied gently, already gathering his flashlight from the toolbox. He gave a brief nod toward the hallway. This might take a little while. I watched as he moved toward the kitchen. His stride steady, his shoulders slightly hunched, as if bracing for more than plumbing. The sound of his boots faded on the stairs, leaving me alone again with the steady drip into the bowl. For the first time since moving into this house, I realized there were corners of it I hadn't thought about in years, corners I had stopped noticing because they were too familiar. The basement door creaked open, slow and deliberate, as though it carried weight heavier than its hinges. I looked up from where I sat at the dining room table, a half-folded dish towel in my lap. Manuel stepped into view. Something in him had changed. The calm, methodical man who had entered the basement an hour earlier now stood pale, his shoulders drawn tight. His hands shook as he set the flashlight on the counter, though he tried to hide it by adjusting the strap of his toolbox. I rose quickly. "Did you find the problem?" My voice was thin, higher than I meant it to be. He swallowed, eyes flicking toward the window, the ceiling, the hallway, as though checking every shadow. Then he leaned close. His whisper barely carried across the quiet kitchen. "Pack your things and leave. Don't tell your son." For a moment, I thought I had misheard. The words struck like cold water poured over my chest. What his face remained grave, the lines around his mouth etched deeper. "Mrs. Whitmore, you cannot stay here tonight. Not another hour." My heart jolted hard against my ribs. "Don't tell Caleb," I repeated, my tongue dry. "What are you implying?" Manuel shook his head, gripping the edge of the counter, as though steadying himself. "I'll explain if you let me. But first, please get your essential things. Documents, medication, whatever you need, and leave quietly." Heat surged to my face. Anger mingled with confusion, the two emotions wrestling inside me. My Caleb, the boy who once begged me for another story before bed, whose scraped knees I cleaned with iodine while he bit back tears. The man who carried boxes up these very stairs when I grew too tired. The suggestion that he of all people was someone I should hide from was unbearable. "That's absurd," I snapped, though my voice shook. "You don't know my son. I know what I saw." Manuel's tone was steady now, but his eyes held a haunted sheen. "And it's not something a stranger could have put there without his knowledge." I pressed my palms against the table, grounding myself against the tide of disbelief. Caleb's face flashed before me, his crooked smile at 16, when he landed his first summer job, the way he clutched my hand at his father's funeral, his whispered promise that he would look after me. "No," I said firmly, though the conviction already frayed. "You must be mistaken. Maybe it's something left by the workers. Maybe—" My voice trailed off, unwilling to complete the thought. Manuel looked at me with a mixture of pity and urgency. "Mrs. Whitmore, I wouldn't risk frightening you if I weren't sure. I've been in hundreds of homes, seen all kinds of systems. What's down there isn't plumbing." The room seemed to close in the ticking of the clock, suddenly louder. My gaze went to the ceiling, where the stain had spread into an ugly blossom. Drip, drip. Each drop struck the bowl below as steady as a heartbeat. My hands trembled as I picked up the towel, only to set it down again. "If you think I'm going to believe my own son," I broke off the words, splintering before they reached air. Manuel stepped back, giving me space, but his whisper came again, firmer this time. "Pack your things. Don't tell him. Please." I turned away, clutching the counter to steady myself. Caleb's laughter echoed in my mind from decades earlier, a boy chasing fireflies in the yard, hollering for me to watch. How could that child grow into a man, a stranger, now warned me to fear? I closed my eyes, and the sound of dripping filled the silence between us. I should have sent him away. I should have slammed the door and clung to my faith in Caleb. Yet when Manuel steadied the flashlight in his hand and asked me to follow my feet, betrayed me. I moved after him through the kitchen, past the basement door yawning open like a throat waiting to swallow. The wooden stairs groaned beneath us. I had walked them thousands of times with baskets of laundry cartons of holiday decorations, jars of peach preserves. But never had the descent felt so heavy each step, slower than the last. The air was cool and smelled of earth and metal, familiar and foreign at once. Manuel's light cut a pale arc across the walls. Dust swirled in its beam. The washer and dryer crouched in their corner just as they always had. Shelves lined with canning jars and cardboard boxes stood unchanged. For a moment, relief fluttered in me. This was my basement, my ordinary basement. Then Manuel raised the beam toward the furnace. "Here," he whispered. Behind the hulking metal body of the furnace, half concealed by copper pipes, something glinted. At first, I thought it was just another valve, some upgrade Caleb had ordered during the renovation. But as Manuel angled the light, the truth sharpened into focus. Thin, translucent tubes snaked upward like veins winding through the shadows, disappearing into the main ductwork. At their base sat a metal box no larger than a bread pan, its surface scarred and humming faintly. Through its slotted side, I saw compartments, some filled with liquid in muted shades of green and amber, others housing small digital timers. Red numbers blinked in sequence, steady, unforgiving. "What is this?" My voice cracked, brittle against the damp stone walls. Manuel crouched, careful not to touch. "This is no part of plumbing, Senora. These tubes lead into your ventilation system. Air from this furnace circulates through your house, and so does whatever is released here." I swayed, gripping the railing. "Released? You mean substances? Slow. Not strong enough to kill in one night, but over time." He let the words trail off as though naming them might give them more power. The damp basement tilted around me. I pressed a hand to my temple, where a dull ache had become too familiar these past months. Fatigue that kept me in bed long past sunrise headaches that made the newspaper blur. The breathlessness I had blamed on age, all of it, came rushing back with cruel clarity. No, I whispered, shaking my head. It must be something else. Some filter. An air purifier, perhaps. Manuel's eyes met mine, steady and grim. I have seen purifiers, humidifiers, filters of every kind. Never this. These liquids. They are measured, timed. Someone knew what they wanted to achieve. The blinking numbers pulsed red against the dark. 1422, 1423, each second passing as though marking down my life. I staggered closer against Manuel's warning. The faint odor reached me, not sharp like bleach, not familiar like gas, but a strange medicinal tang that caught in the throat. I clutched my scarf to my mouth and stepped back quickly. Stomach turning. Don't breathe. Close, Manuel said softly. He steadied me by the elbow, his hand surprisingly gentle. Mrs. Whitmore, I cannot pretend to know why it is here, but it was not strangers who put it in your basement. Whoever did this had time, access, and reason. My knees weakened. I remembered Caleb insisting I leave the men alone during the renovation. How he stayed late after the crews left, claiming he was checking measurements. How he locked the basement door one weekend, saying fumes from sealant made it unsafe. I had accepted it all without question. I pressed my fist against my chest, forcing back a wave of nausea that was no longer just physical. In my mind, Caleb's face flickered, my boy at 7 years old, cheeks smudged with dirt, bringing me dandelions as though they were roses. My boy at 17 grinning when he passed his driver's test. My boy at 45 avoiding my eyes across the dinner table. The red numbers blinked on pitiless. Manuel's voice was quiet, but the words still struck like a hammer. Someone has been making you sick, little by little. Manuel's words pressed against me with the weight of iron. Leave, and do not tell your son. The air in the basement had already begun to feel poisonous, thick, and untrustworthy. I followed him back up the stairs, my hand gliding along the banister, as though the wood itself might vanish if I let go. In the kitchen, Manuel stood with his toolbox closed, his eyes flicking to the window. 5 minutes, he said firmly. Pack only what matters most. 5 minutes. How do you measure a life in minutes? I looked around my kitchen, the plates stacked neatly in the cupboard, the recipe cards in my mother's handwriting, the curtains I had hemmed myself, and I thought of all the decades folded into this house. But I had no time to linger. I climbed the stairs quickly, each step an effort, as though dragging a mountain behind me. My bedroom looked the same as it had for years. The quilt I had stitched, the photograph of my wedding day, the scent of lavender polish on the old dresser. None of it would fit in the narrow band of time I'd been given. I went to the safe in my closet. My fingers trembled as I turned the combination, the clicks echoing louder than usual. Inside lay the fragile bones of my future. My will, the deed to the townhouse, the insurance papers, the thick folder of bank documents. I pulled them out and slipped them into my handbag. On the nightstand sat a photograph of Richard, my late husband, taken the year before he died. His eyes were bright, his smile quiet, and assured the way he always steadied me when storms came. I hesitated, then slid the photo into the bag. If I had to walk out of my life, I would not do it without him. I caught my reflection in the mirror, hair hastily pinned back, face drained of color, eyes wide with disbelief. I looked like a woman halfway between who she had been and who she would be forced to become. The phone on the dresser rang suddenly, its shrill cry jolting me. My heart lurched. Caleb's name glowed on the screen. I pressed the receiver to my ear, my voice steadier than my hands. "Mom," he said, his tone clipped. "Did the plumber arrive?" "Yes," I answered, forcing calm. "He's here now working." "Good." Don't let him cheat you. I'll check everything tonight." His voice carried an edge that might have been concern or might have been something else entirely. "I'll be fine," I replied. I prayed he couldn't hear the hammering of my pulse. A pause stretched long enough to make me wonder if he sensed something in my voice. "Then I'll see you for dinner." The line went dead. I lowered the phone slowly, my knuckles white around it. Dinner. Could I sit across from him tonight, knowing what I had just seen? Could I smile at him, pass him the bread and pretend I wasn't tasting betrayal in every bite? My handbag sagged heavy on my shoulder, weighed down by papers and memories. I gave the room one last look, the quilt, the curtains, the mirror, and felt a sharp grief twist in my chest. Leaving this house was not just leaving wood and plaster. It was leaving the decades that had shaped me, the laughter that had filled these rooms, the grief I had carried within them. But Manuel's words rang in my ears. 5 minutes. I closed the safe, pulled the closet door shut, and walked out of the bedroom without looking back. The cool air outside hit my cheeks like a shock. I clutched my handbag tighter, stepping onto the porch where the late afternoon light slanted across Whitaker Street. The house behind me loomed taller than ever, every brick suddenly foreign, no longer a home, but a trap I could no longer claim as mine. Manuel's truck idled at the curb, a workman's vehicle with its paint dulled from years of sun and its bed cluttered with tools. He opened the passenger door for me. His expression gave nothing away, only a firm nod that said now quickly. I slid inside. The seat smelled faintly of oil and leather polish, grounding me in something ordinary. Manuel shut the door, walked around and climbed in beside me. The engine hummed and we pulled away from the curb. I looked back once, just once, as the townhouse shrank behind us. Lace curtains glowing pale in the window where I had sat that very morning sipping coffee. We drove in silence for several blocks. My hands trembled in my lap, clutching the strap of my bag. Every nerve in me screamed not to trust this man, not to leave everything I knew behind, at the word of someone I had only met hours ago. Yet when I glanced at him, his hands were steady on the wheel, eyes alert, scanning mirrors as though the burden of watching over me was one he carried without question. "You don't need to be afraid of me," he said at last, voice low, eyes still on the road. "I told you to leave because I've seen what happens when people ignore signs." I turned toward him. "What signs?" He exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that comes from a place long buried. "My mother. Years ago, she trusted someone she shouldn't have, her own brother. He was supposed to handle her accounts, look after her after my father died. Instead, he siphoned everything. By the time we found out, she had nothing left. She died believing her brother loved her, even after the truth came out." The weight of his words settled between us. His tone wasn't bitter, just tired, the voice of someone who had carried pain so long it had worn smooth. I promised myself, he continued, that if I ever saw something that smelled of betrayal in a family, I wouldn't turn away. "That's why I couldn't leave your house without telling you." I pressed a hand against my chest as if to still the ache there. "It feels impossible to believe. Caleb is my son." The last words broke fragile in the air. "I know," Manuel said quietly, "and I don't ask you to believe me completely. Only to believe your own body. You said you've been tired, sick, weaker than before." I closed my eyes. The headaches, the fatigue, the breathlessness symptoms I had brushed aside as age. Now, with his words, they arranged themselves into a pattern I could no longer ignore. We reached a red light. Manuel's hands rested on the wheel, firm, but relaxed the way a man drives who is prepared for anything. For the first time in years, I felt someone was paying attention, not just to what I said, but to what I couldn't say. When the light turned green, the truck moved forward again. I stared out the window at the unfamiliar stretch of road, my old neighborhood fading behind me. My life had been uprooted in less than an afternoon, yet beside me sat sat a stranger who seemed to understand the shape of my fear more than my own son ever had. A fragile thread of hope, thin as spun glass, wound itself around my chest. Perhaps I was not entirely alone. Manuel parked the truck in front of a modest roadside motel just past the edge of downtown. Neon letters flickered weakly above the office, and a cracked Coca-Cola machine hummed in the corner. It was the kind of place no one remembered passing, which made it perfect for what he called laying low. He paid for the room in cash, a quiet exchange with the clerk, then handed me the key. Room 12 smelled faintly of lemon cleanser and old smoke. The curtains were thin, the carpet worn, but the lock clicked firm when Manuel tested it. For the first time all day, I felt I might actually be hidden. We sat opposite each other at the small table by the window, a single lamp casting yellow light between us. My handbag lay open beside me. Papers spread like fragile armor will deed insurance bank folders. I touched the corner of Richard's photograph, my thumb brushing his smile, drawing steadiness from his face. Mrs. Whitmore Manuel began carefully. We need to decide. Do we call the police now, or wait until I can gather proof? The words tightened my chest. If we call now, they'll come to the house with a warrant. Yes, he nodded. They'll find the system if it's still there. But if Caleb suspects, he'll have time to remove it. One afternoon is all it would take to make everything vanish. I imagined Caleb's boots thudding across the floorboards, his hands unscrewing tubes, carrying the metal box out under the cover of night. The thought chilled me more than the motel's draft through the window. But if we wait, I said slowly, I'll spend another night knowing that thing is in my home, knowing what it's been doing to me. My hands trembled. I folded them tightly in my lap to still them. I don't know if I can bear that. Manuel's expression softened. He leaned forward, elbows on the table. I won't let you face it alone. Tomorrow morning I'll go back as if to double-check my work. I'll take photographs, maybe even samples. If we have evidence in hand, the police won't hesitate. I studied him across the dim light. A man I'd known for mere hours was asking me to trust him with my very survival. Yet his voice carried no bravado, only quiet certainty. What if Caleb sees you? I asked. I'll be careful. He gave a small smile, weary but reassuring. I've done harder things. Silence stretched. I heard the hum of the heater, the distant hiss of traffic. I thought of Caleb's face as a boy, cheeks flushed from running in the park, his laughter carrying down Whitaker Street. How had we reached this precipice where I had to weigh my son against my own life? I looked back at Manuel. If we wait and he destroys everything, then it will be my word against his. I'll sound like a paranoid old woman. That's why we need proof, he said gently. One more night. It's a risk, yes, but without it the truth could be buried forever. The lamp buzzed faintly, its filament straining. My throat tightened as I thought of my house, my bedroom, the quiet poison seeping through its vents. But Manuel's plan was the only road that didn't end with Caleb free to erase the evidence. I gathered the papers back into my bag, closing the clasp with a click. One more night, I whispered, as though speaking it aloud might steady me. Manuel leaned back, his eyes still sharp despite the fatigue lining his face. Then tomorrow, we get proof. Morning came gray and heavy through the thin motel curtains. I had barely slept, dozing in short bursts, my body tense at every hum of traffic or slam of a distant door. By the time Manuel's truck pulled into the lot, I felt raw, stretched thin, as if my skin could no longer hold the weight of my bones. He entered the room quietly, closing the door with care. His face was drained, his eyes darker than the night before. He set his toolbox on the floor, but kept his hand on the handle a moment, steadying himself. What happened? My voice cracked with dread. I went back early, he said, lowering himself into the chair across from me. His jacket smelled faintly of damp air and dust. I told Caleb I needed to check that the repair held. He barely looked at me, just waved me toward the basement. but he was on the phone. Manuel rubbed his forehead with his palm as if the memory itself carried weight. I heard enough to know he's drowning in debt. Gambling. He owes tens of thousands, maybe more. He told someone he needed money fast or they'd collect in other ways. The words sank like stones into my stomach. Debt. Threats. My son's silence at the dinner table, the short temper. The hollow eyes, all of it suddenly framed by desperation. Manuel reached into his jacket and pulled out a battered notebook. He set it on the table between us. Its cover was smeared with dust, the edges bent from being hidden. I found this behind the furnace. I touched the cover with shaking fingers before opening it. The handwriting was Caleb's. I would have known the sharp slanted script anywhere. I had seen it in school assignments, on birthday cards, on lists he used to tack to the fridge. Now it was here, binding me in ink. The pages were filled with dates, times, and notes in clinical detail. March 4th. Mother complained of headache after dinner. March 19th. Excessive fatigue, slept until 10 a.m. April 2nd. Shortness of breath after walking stairs. Each line was my life reduced to symptoms recorded with the detachment of a man tracking an experiment. My breath caught when I turned to the more recent pages. August 14th. Memory lapses noted. She forgot to water the plants. September 3rd. Cough persistent, conceal concentrations before evening meal. My throat burned. I shoved the notebook away as if it might scald me. Every change you noticed in yourself, Manuel said quietly. He wrote it down, adjusting the device to match your decline. Rage swelled, eclipsing the grief that had threatened to drown me since yesterday. The boy I had raised, whose scraped knees I had kissed, had studied my weakness like a predator learning its prey. Not even the privacy of my pain had been mine. He had catalogued it page by page, as though I were no more than a test subject. I rose abruptly, pacing the narrow room. He watched me stumble. He watched me forget things, cough, struggle for breath, and he wrote it down. My voice grew hoarse, but I didn't care. He didn't try to help. He just sharpened his knife. Manuel let the words settle. He didn't move to calm me, didn't try to quiet the storm. Perhaps he knew I needed the fire, that it was the only thing that could keep me standing. When at last I stopped trembling by the window, he spoke again. Now you know why silence isn't an option. We have proof, but Caleb is desperate, and desperate men don't wait long. I closed my eyes, the rage still burning hot in my chest. My grief was gone, my denial stripped away. All that remained was a sharpened edge ready to cut. The motel room felt smaller by the hour, the lemon cleaner scent fading until all I smelled was fear. I sat on the bed with my handbag beside me, the notebook Manuel had found lying open on the table. Its pages glared at me like open wounds. The phone buzzed in my hand. A text. Caleb. Where are you? Dinner at 6. Just 6 words, but they sank their claws into me. Dinner at 6. The same words he'd said nearly every evening for years. He knew my schedule better than I did. He had been timing me, charting me, feeding me poison to fit neatly into his calendar. I didn't answer. My thumb hovered, then pulled back. Another buzz. Not like you to be out this long. Call me. I set the phone down as if it might bite. The lamp flickered in the corner, throwing light across Richard's photograph. His smile steadied me, reminded me I still had choices. I would not be the obedient figure Caleb had written into his ledger. I crossed to the closet where I had stowed my papers. From the pile, I drew out the envelope with my bank information. The account numbers glared back at me, fragile doors into everything I had built. Caleb must have assumed they would one day swing open for him. Not anymore. With stiff fingers, I dialed the bank's after-hours line, listening as a recorded voice guided me through options. When I finally reached a representative, I gave calm, precise instructions. Freeze the joint account. Caleb sometimes accessed cancel my debit card and change the security questions I had foolishly left predictable. My mother's maiden name, the street I grew up on, questions Caleb could have answered in his sleep. Now they were replaced with things only I would know. The woman on the line confirmed the changes, her voice brisk, efficient, unaware she was dismantling a trap. When I hung up, a new text waited. Mom, answer me. You're scaring me. The irony burned. He had cataloged my decline in ink, timed my weakness by the hour, and now he feigned fear because I broke pattern. I ignored it. Instead, I dug into my bag for the small safe where I kept my passport and emergency cash. The code had been Richard's birthday, Caleb's grandfather, whose date Caleb knew as well as his own. My hands shook as I spun the numbers to a new sequence, one only I would remember. A private date between Richard and me buried in memory. Click. The safe sealed with new certainty. Another buzz. This time the message carried teeth. If you don't come home, I'll come find you. I sat back on the bed, the phone burning hot in my palm. It wasn't love that spoke from that screen. It was control sharpened into threat. For the first time in months, perhaps years, I felt the fog lift. Caleb had written his script for me, page by page, line by line, fatigue, confusion, decline, silence. But tonight, I had broken it. I had stepped outside. His plan pulled the pen from his hand. Manuel returned just after dark, carrying coffee and sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. He set them down without asking what the messages said, as though he already knew. You made changes, he said softly, noticing the safe by my side, the bank papers tucked away. Yes. I answered, my voice steadier than I expected. I won't let him hold the strings anymore. The phone buzzed again, but I turned it face down on the bed. I had heard enough. The motel room clock ticked louder at night, its hands dragging across silence that seemed endless. I lay on the bed, my handbag tucked under my arm, as if I could guard my whole life by clutching it close. Manuel had booked the room under his own name, a kindness that felt like armor. Still, the thin walls did little to quiet my mind. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, Caleb's messages burned across the dark. Dinner at 6. Call me. I'll come find you. His words no longer sounded like the voice of a son. They had the sharpness of command, the cold weight of possession. I rolled onto my side and stared at the cheap curtains, their edges frayed the fabric stiff. My mind drifted unbidden to other times, moments I had long ago brushed aside. I remembered 2 winters ago when the first property developer knocked on our door. The neighborhood was changing old houses, bought up, renovated, resold for impossible sums. Caleb stood with me in the parlor afterward, his jaw tight. You could make a fortune if you sold, Mom. You don't need this much space anymore. At the time, I laughed it off. This house is my memory, not for sale. He had shrugged, but his eyes lingered on the walls, the windows, the yard, calculating. Months later, I caught him rifling through my desk. He claimed he was looking for stamps, but my bank folder lay half open in the drawer. He closed it too quickly, smiling too easily. I wanted to believe him. I did believe him because the alternative that he was studying my accounts felt like betrayal too heavy to carry. Another memory surfaced the night he asked if I had updated my will. We had been drinking tea in the kitchen, the light soft, the world quiet. He spoke casually, as if it were natural for a son to ask about his mother's end-of-life papers. I told myself it was concern, responsibility. Now the words rang in my ears with a new tone. I pressed my palms to my eyes. How many times had I repainted suspicion into love? How many times had I chosen the softer story because the truth was unbearable? The clock ticked again. The sound was steady, patient, a reminder that time had always been moving, even while I stood still in my denial. A swell of self-blame rose in me, sharp as bile. I had been blind. I had been weak. What kind of mother doesn't see what her child is capable of until a stranger points it out? Tears came then hot and bitter. I let them fall silently into the stiff motel pillow. But when the wave passed, something else remained. Not forgiveness for Caleb, but a soft forgiveness for myself. I had loved my son with the purest part of me. Of course, I wanted to see his questions as care, his intrusions as clumsy affection. Love had blinded me, yes, but that blindness had not been foolishness. It had been human. The clock ticked past midnight. I turned onto my back, staring up at the ceiling, my breath slow steadier now. I could not change the past or the warnings I had ignored, but I could change what happened next. The night air was damp heavy with the scent of rain on brick. Manuel insisted on parking his truck 2 blocks away, saying it was safer not to leave it right in front of the motel. I followed him down the narrow alley that cut between shuttered shops, my handbag clutched close. The hum of the city was distant here, swallowed by shadows. Then I saw him, Caleb. He leaned against Manuel's truck, his broad shoulders filling the glow of a street lamp, his head bent as though checking his phone. When he lifted his face, my breath caught. His eyes weren't the eyes I had known, they were sharper, fevered, rimmed with exhaustion. In his hand glinted a tire iron. Beside him stood another man, taller, younger, with the hard face of someone accustomed to fights. I didn't know him, but his steel-toed boots and tense posture told me enough. A friend from the job site Caleb had once said of a man who lingered too long in our driveway. Now I understood. This was no friend. This was muscle. Manuel froze. His body shifted, protective sliding half in front of me. "Stay behind me," he murmured. Caleb stepped forward, tire iron swinging loosely at his side, his mouth twisted into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Thought you could run, Mom." His voice cracked with a jagged edge. "You disappear, stop answering my calls, and then I find you with him." He nodded toward Manuel, his tone dripping contempt. The other man pulled something from his jacket. A syringe, the needle long and gleaming under the streetlight. A chill surged through me. The memory of tubes in the basement, the strange tang in the air, it all culminated here, distilled into a single vial. Manuel's stance hardened. "Back off, Caleb," he warned, voice low. Caleb's laugh was bitter, broken. "Don't pretend you care. She's mine to take care of, mine to decide for. Everything she has belongs to me." He raised the tire iron higher. I stepped forward, my hand out, ignoring Manuel's hiss of protest. My voice shook, but I forced it past my dry throat. "Caleb." He faltered, just slightly. I felt the opening and reached for it, pulling a name from the depths of memory, a name he hadn't heard in decades. Caleb Bear. The nickname left my lips like a plea and a prayer. He froze, his jaw clenching. For a heartbeat, his face softened, and I glimpsed the boy he had once been. The boy who climbed into my lap with scraped knees, who whispered that he'd never let me be lonely. The moment cracked as the hired man hissed, "Do it." He shoved the syringe forward, urging Caleb on. The spell of hesitation broke. Caleb's grip tightened around the tire iron, his eyes torn between fury and something older buried. Sirens pierced the night. Blue and red lights spilled into the alley, bouncing off brick walls. Tires screeched as patrol cars blocked both ends. "Police," a voice barked. "Drop it now." Caleb's eyes darted wildly. The man with the syringe cursed, stepping back, but officers closed in. Caleb's chest heaved, his face twisted between shame and rage. For a moment, the tire iron hovered as if he might strike anyway. Then it clattered to the ground. Hands yanked him back, cuffs snapping around his wrists. The syringe clinked against pavement as the other man was restrained. I sagged against Manuel, my knees weak, the world spinning. Caleb's eyes caught mine once more as he was dragged toward the cruiser. Not a sun's eyes, not anymore, but something fractured, emptied of everything I had believed. The sirens wailed louder, swallowing the sound of my breaking heart. Blue lights washed over the alley, bouncing off wet brick and filling the air with a dizzying strobe. I sat on the curb, my body trembling, Manuel's steady hand at my shoulder. Caleb had been forced into the back of a patrol car, his head ducked, wrists bound. He didn't look at me now, though I burned holes into the side of the cruiser, straining to reconcile the boy I'd raised with the man they dragged away. The accomplice had tried to bolt when the sirens grew close, sprinting toward the far end of the alley. But the officers were faster. I saw him pinned against the wall, the syringe clattering to the pavement. His curses drowned by the command of men who did not yield. His voice faded into the night as they carried him off in another squad car. An officer approached Manuel and me, her face illuminated by the flicker of lights. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" I shook my head, though the truth was more complicated. My body was intact, but my heart felt as though it had been shattered into 1,000 sharp pieces. The officer waved over a paramedic team, and within moments I found myself seated in the back of an ambulance, its doors wide open to the humid Savannah night. A young medic draped a blanket over my shoulders. The cotton smelled faintly of bleach and starch. I clutched it as though it were a lifeline. Manuel climbed in after a brief word with another officer. He crouched beside me, his hand brushing mine. "The photos are safe," he said quietly. I backed them up before Caleb destroyed my camera. "They're in the cloud, untouchable." The words steadied me. Proof. For the first time, the nightmare was no longer just my word against Caleb's charm. It was ink, images, numbers, all pointing to the truth. A detective slid onto the bench opposite me, flipping open a notebook. His tie was loosened, his face lined with long years in the job. "Mrs. Whitmore, I know this is hard, but we need your statement while it's fresh." The blanket bunched tighter in my fists. My throat felt dry, but I nodded. "I'll tell you everything." So I spoke. I told him about the leak, the call to Caleb, the way he pushed me to use a new plumber. I described Manuel's discovery in the basement, the tubes, the box, the red numbers blinking. I told them about the notebook, the ledger of my own decline written in my son's hand. My voice cracked when I recounted the alley. Caleb's eyes wild, the word I had used, Caleb Bear, and the flicker of hesitation that almost saved us both. The detective's pen moved steadily, capturing words I never thought I'd have to say. Mother, son, attempted murder, syringe. When I faltered, Manuel squeezed my hand, anchoring me back to the bench. His presence reminded me that truth, however unbearable, was my only shield. By the time I finished, the night had grown deeper. The sirens had faded, leaving only the low murmur of radios and the rustle of uniforms in the alley outside. The detective closed his notebook, his gaze firm but not unkind. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitmore. This is enough to move forward." I nodded, but the blanket felt heavier now. Every word I had spoken was true, but each one had also carved away the last fragile layer of love I had clung to. My statement was not just evidence. It was the burial of the son I thought I knew. 2 days after the arrest, I returned to Whitaker Street under police escort. The townhouse rose from the sidewalk exactly as it always had. Shutters painted sage green lace curtains drawn against the sun. From the outside, it still looked like home, but inside, I knew everything had changed. Detectives moved through the rooms with latex gloves and careful steps. The sound of radios crackled faintly against the hush. I followed them only as far as the parlor, where Richard's armchair still sat, angled toward the window. The smell of coffee and lemon polish had been replaced by the sterile tang of chemical spray. One of the technicians called out from upstairs. Residue confirmed in the vents. Trace elements match initial field tests. His voice was clinical, but I flinched as though struck. Another officer passed carrying a sealed evidence bag. Inside was the metal box from the basement, now dark and lifeless tubes, coiled like snakes cut from their master. It looked smaller under fluorescent light than it had in the shadows, but its weight pressed heavier on me now. I lingered in the doorway of the dining room. The ceiling stain had spread wider since the day of the leak. Ugly and brown, a wound the plaster could no longer hide. Beneath it, the bowl still sat on the table where I had left it, filled with stagnant water. The sight hollowed me. My house had been bleeding, and I had not understood. The officers spoke in measured tones as they worked their words more for each other than for me. Tubes integrated into duct system, timers set for dispersal cycles, concentrations adjusted over weeks. Each phrase echoed through the rooms like a verdict. I stepped toward the staircase, my hand brushing the banister, polished by decades of use. How many times had Caleb raced down these steps, his laughter ringing off the walls? How many times had I scolded him for sliding down the rail only to hide my smile when he wasn't looking? The wood still bore those memories, but now they sat beside darker ones, nights when he lingered after the crews had gone, adjusting, planning, preparing. In my bedroom, the quilt lay folded neatly at the foot of the bed, untouched. Yet the air felt violated, as though betrayal had seeped into the fibers. I sat on the edge of the mattress, staring at the safe in the closet. I had changed the code, yes, but the act felt hollow now. The safe could guard papers, not trust. Downstairs, a detective approached, his expression careful. "Mrs. Whitmore, the evidence is strong. We'll have a full report for you soon." He meant it as reassurance, but the words fell flat. Strong evidence did not mend walls or erase memories. I wandered into the kitchen, pausing by the window that overlooked the yard. The camellias Richard had planted years ago were blooming bright against the gray day. For a moment, I let the sight soften me. Then the weight of the house pressed in again. Every corner carried a memory I had cherished, but now each was shadowed by Caleb's intent. The vents whispered betrayal. The walls remembered poison. Even the floors seemed complicit, holding the footsteps of a son who had turned them into a stage for his cruelty. The officers carried box after box out the front door, their boots thudding across the porch. I stood in the kitchen, my hands gripping the edge of the counter, and realized the truth: the house was no longer mine. Not really. Home is not just bricks and mortar. It is trust. And trust once shattered cannot be swept up and put away with the evidence bags. The courthouse smelled faintly of varnish and paper, a blend of wood polish and old ink that clung to the paneled walls. I sat at the witness table, my palms pressed together to keep them from trembling. The ceiling fans turned lazily above, stirring the heavy air. Caleb was only a few yards away. His suit was pressed, his hair combed neatly, but the boy I had raised was nowhere in his eyes. They darted sharp and restless, as though the walls themselves were closing in. For a moment I thought of him as a child standing in front of the principal after some playground scuffle, his jaw set in stubborn denial. But this was no playground, and the stakes were far greater. The prosecutor's voice rang out, clear, steady. The evidence will show that Mr. Whitmore, driven by mounting gambling debts, constructed a device intended to poison the air inside his mother's home. It will show he cataloged her symptoms, adjusting the mechanism to accelerate her decline. The jury leaned forward, eyes fixed on the photographs displayed on a projector, the tubes, the metal box, the timers blinking red. Each image felt like a knife twisted deeper into me, but I forced myself to look, to see. Caleb's attorney rose, his tone smooth, practiced. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we have here is a tragic misunderstanding. An elderly woman, 72, prone to fatigue and memory, lapses influenced by a tradesman with his own motives. There is no proof beyond paranoia. No son would do such a thing. The words scraped against me, dismissing my years, my mind, my very ability to know danger when it sat in my lungs. I clenched my fists in my lap, forcing myself to breathe. Then came the experts. A chemical engineer explained how the substances, though diluted, could cause gradual respiratory distress, confusion, and fatigue. A toxicologist confirmed the traces found in my blood matched the residues in the vents. Each testimony stacked upon the last, a scaffold of truth too solid to be ignored. When they called me, the courtroom seemed to shrink. I walked to the stand, my knees steady, though my heart thudded hard against my ribs. The oath felt heavy in my mouth, the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. I spoke of the headaches, the exhaustion, the fog I had mistaken for age. I told them about Manuel's discovery, the notebook filled with my decline, written in Caleb's hand. Each word felt like tearing cloth, ripping apart the last threads that had bound me to the son I loved. Finally, the prosecutor asked if I wished to address him directly. I turned my head. Caleb's eyes met mine for the first time in weeks. For a heartbeat, I searched for my boy, the one who brought me wildflowers, who promised to look after me. But all I found was a stranger behind glassy eyes. My voice did not tremble. You wanted my death, Caleb. But you only gave me clarity. The silence in the courtroom was thick. For the first time, his face flickered, something between anger and shame, something human that had been hidden too long. The judge's gavel brought the moment back to order. Proceedings moved forward, words rising and falling around me, but my sentence hung in the air, unmoving. It was not just testimony. It was a farewell. I stepped down from the stand, my legs surprisingly strong. Behind me, the courtroom murmured the sound of strangers deciding the fate of the boy who had once been my world. The day I handed over the keys, the house stood silent. The realtor's smile was practiced, her handshake firm, but I barely heard her words. I slid the worn brass keys into her palm, their weight lighter than I'd imagined. They had once opened every door of my life, but now they belonged to someone else. I didn't linger. I couldn't. To stand in the parlor again, to smell lemon polish, and see Richard's chair sitting empty, it would be like reopening a wound that had only just begun to scar. I walked down the steps without looking back, my handbag at my side, the deed money waiting in the bank for the next chapter. That chapter began in Tybee Island, where the sea rolled in with the constancy of breath. My new apartment was small, 2 rooms perched above the boardwalk, with a balcony facing the ocean. The air smelled of salt and freedom. The sound of waves reached me even in my sleep, a lullaby stronger than memory. For the first time in years, I breathed without heaviness. Unpacking was simple. A few books, a stack of photographs, Richard's picture on the nightstand. The absence of clutter felt liberating. Every object that remained had been chosen, not inherited by habit. My life was smaller, yes, but sharper, free of shadows. It wasn't long before I found a rhythm. Each Tuesday morning, I joined a circle of neighbors at the community hall. Retirees, widows, a handful of men with stories as weathered as their hands. Together, we started a group to teach seniors about financial safety. Manuel spoke at our first meeting, his voice calm but insistent, explaining how to recognize manipulation, how to protect accounts, how to trust instincts over excuses. I sat among them not as a victim, but as someone who had survived. Each time I told my story, I watched recognition dawn, in tired eyes watched fear turn into resolve. My shame softened in their company, replaced by purpose. On quiet evenings, I wrote. My new will lay open on the desk, the ink fresh where my pen had marked each line. The funds I had once assumed would pass to Caleb were now divided differently. Scholarships for women returning to school late in life, grants for community health clinics, donations for shelters. Legacies for people who needed them, who would not squander them. It hurt, yes, to sign my name beneath a will that excluded my only child. But the act was not born of vengeance. It was clarity. Love had built the house on Whitaker Street, but it had not been enough to keep it safe. Now I understood that safety is not built from walls, it is built from boundaries. One evening, after a long walk along the sand, I sat on my balcony with a cup of tea. The sun lowered itself into the horizon, painting the waves in gold. I thought of the townhouse, the rooms that had betrayed me, the walls that had listened to poison. They no longer held me. Here in this little apartment with the sea for company, I finally closed the door on that chapter. The keys were gone. The house belonged to strangers. What remained was mine. My voice, my choices, and a future written not by a son's demands, but by my own hand. The morning light spilled gently across the balcony, soft and golden, carried in with the scent of salt, and the hush of waves breaking against Tybee's shore. I had brought a small pot of roses to this apartment, a stubborn insistence on beauty even in tight spaces. They thrived in the sea breeze, their petals delicate, yet resilient, bending with the wind, but never breaking. I carried them inside, setting the pot on the windowsill where the light could reach. The air in the apartment was cool, touched with the faint perfume of the blooms. I trimmed one rose carefully, its stem yielding beneath the shears with a satisfying snap. Cradling it in my palm, I walked to the nightstand where Richard's photograph stood. His smile, forever caught in black and white, met mine with its familiar calm. I placed the rose beside the frame in a small glass jar, the petals brushing gently against the glass. Another day, love, I whispered, my voice soft but steady. And still, I'm here. The phone buzzed on the table, breaking the silence. A text from Manuel. Thank you for stopping by yesterday. The group listens differently when it's you. You make them believe it can happen and that they can survive it. I smiled faintly, typing a brief reply. It helps me too. It was true. Each time I sat with those seniors, each time I spoke of the house on Whitaker Street, of the poison in the vents of the notebook that turned love into ledger, I shed another layer of fear. What had nearly ended me now formed a bridge binding me to others who had been silenced or doubted. I moved back to the desk where a small stack of index cards waited. I had begun writing them for myself, small reminders that anchored me when memory threatened to blur or when doubt crept in. I picked up my pen, the ink flowing in my familiar hand. Respect, not pity, is the rent for a place in my life. I set the card upright against the lamp where I would see it each morning. It was not for anyone else, not a lesson to preach or a warning to hang above a door. It was mine, a promise I owed myself, after years of mistaking silence for peace. The apartment was quiet, except for the sea. Outside, gulls wheeled over the water, their cries sharp against the horizon. The world had grown smaller for me, but it was lighter too. There were no hidden vents here, no shadows creeping through walls. Only open-air roses blooming in pots, and a horizon that stretched wide and untouchable. I sank into the chair by the window, tea warm in my hands, and let the light move across my face. The pain had not vanished. I doubted it ever would, but it no longer ruled me. It was simply part of me, a thread woven into the larger fabric of survival. Richard's rose leaned toward the light, its petals glowing. I reached out, touched the cool glass of the jar, and breathed deeply. Respect, I thought. Not pity. That was the price for standing at my side. And at last I had learned to ask it. The sea answered in its endless rhythm, the waves carrying away the rest.